The early morning sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting soft golden patterns across the bedroom. Emma, a woman in her early 30s, lay awake, staring at the ceiling. It wasn't the sunlight that woke her. It was the strange stillness beside her. For years, waking up had been a comforting ritual. Her husband Daniel would turn to her with a soft smile and whisper, "Good morning, love." It was a small thing, but it had become the glue that held her mornings together. But today, nothing. She turned her head slowly, hoping to find him lost in peaceful sleep. Instead, he was wide awake, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. The warmth of his usual demeanor seemed replaced by something unfamiliar, cold, distant. "Good morning," Emma ventured hesitantly, trying to break the silence. Daniel responded with a curt nod, barely glancing at her. It wasn't just his behavior that caught her off guard, it was his eyes. They lacked the softness she had always loved, replaced by a guarded expression she couldn't read. Emma's mind wandered back to just a week ago, when they were laughing over dinner, reminiscing about their honeymoon in Santorini. They'd had their differences, of course, who doesn't? But their bond always felt unshakable. Daniel would leave sweet notes on her coffee mug before heading to work, and she'd surprise him with his favorite meals after a long day. Their connection wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. Now, sitting in that same bed, she felt a chilling gap between them, as if they had become strangers overnight. The shift hadn't been dramatic, it had crept in slowly, like an unwanted guest. Daniel had started staying late at work more often, brushing off her questions with vague explanations. He had stopped asking about her day, and their evening conversations had dwindled to awkward silences. At first, Emma chalked it up to stress. He was managing a new project at work, and she knew how demanding his job could be. But this morning, the change felt undeniable. Emma's chest tightened as doubt seeped in. Was it something she had done? She replayed their recent interactions, searching for clues. There had been no major arguments, no obvious rifts. Yet here they were, two people sharing a bed, separated by an invisible wall. Confusion gave way to sadness, and sadness to fear. Emma wasn't just worried about what had changed. She was terrified of what it meant for their future. She decided to ignore the knot in her stomach for now, clinging to the hope that this was just a phase. "Do you want some coffee?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. "No, I'll grab something at the office," Daniel replied, his tone sharp enough to sting. As he got up and left the room, Emma stayed behind, her thoughts swirling like a storm. The man who had once been her anchor now felt like a puzzle she couldn't solve. The weeks that followed Daniel's sudden change were marked by a growing sense of unease. Emma felt as though she were navigating a maze blindfolded, every turn leading to more questions than answers. Daniel's once affectionate gestures vanished entirely. The sweet notes, the random hugs, even the way he used to say her name with a smile. It was all gone. Instead, he became engrossed in his phone, texting late into the night, his screen tilted away from her. "Who are you talking to so late?" Emma asked one evening, trying to keep her tone light, though her heart raced. "Just work stuff," Daniel replied curtly, not bothering to look up. It wasn't just his actions but also his words, or lack thereof. Conversations became perfunctory, as if he were checking a box rather than genuinely engaging. On rare occasions when Emma mustered the courage to confront him about the growing distance, his responses were either dismissive or defensive. "You're imagining things, Emma," he snapped one night, his voice tinged with irritation. "Not everything has to be a big deal." But to her, it was a big deal. It was everything. Emma found herself spiraling into self-doubt. Had she done something wrong? She replayed their recent months over and over, searching for clues. Was it the time she canceled their dinner plans to stay late at work? Or maybe when she forgot their anniversary in the chaos of planning her sister's wedding? These weren't monumental mistakes, but in her mind they loomed large, like cracks in a foundation she feared was crumbling. The stress began to take its toll. Emma's appetite waned, and her once restful nights turned into hours of tossing and turning. Even her coworkers noticed her distracted demeanor. "You okay, Emma? You've seemed off lately," her colleague Jenna asked during lunch one day. Emma forced a smile. "Just a lot on my plate, I guess." But deep down, she knew the truth. Her marriage, her safe haven, was slipping through her fingers, and she didn't know how to stop it. One evening, the tension between them reached a breaking point. "Emma, Unable to bear the silence any longer, confronted Daniel in the living room. "We need to talk," she began, her voice trembling but determined. Daniel sighed heavily, setting his phone down. "What now, Emma?" "What now?" she echoed, her voice rising. "You've been distant, cold. I don't even recognize you anymore." "What's going on, Daniel? Is it me? Is there someone else?" His expression darkened. "Why do you always jump to conclusions? Maybe I've just been stressed. Ever think about that?" "Then talk to me," Emma pleaded. "I'm your wife. I'm supposed to be your partner, not some stranger you avoid." For a moment, Daniel seemed to soften, but it was fleeting. "You're always so needy," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for her to hear. Emma's heart shattered. "Needy?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're always demanding answers, always wanting me to fix things," he said, standing up. "Maybe the problem isn't me. Maybe it's you." After that argument, Emma threw herself into trying to mend their relationship. She planned a surprise dinner, cooking Daniel's favorite meal and setting the table with candles and soft music. She hoped to recreate the warmth they had lost, to remind him of what they once shared. When Daniel walked in that evening, she greeted him with a hopeful smile. "I thought we could have a nice dinner together," she said, gesturing to the table. But his reaction was a dagger to her heart. "I'm not really hungry," he said flatly. "I ate at work." Emma felt the weight of her efforts crashing down around her. She sat at the table alone, the untouched meal growing cold, tears streaming down her face. Emma turned to her journal, pouring her feelings onto the pages late at night when the house was silent. Writing became her refuge, a way to process the storm of emotions she couldn't voice aloud. "I don't know who he is anymore," she scribbled one night. "And maybe I'm starting to lose myself too." She also began seeking solace in small, quiet moments: a walk in the park, a phone call with her sister, an extra hour spent reading a favorite novel. These fleeting escapes offered a reprieve from the growing chasm in her marriage, but they weren't enough to silence the ache in her chest. One evening, Daniel came home with flowers. It was the first time in months he'd done something remotely thoughtful. "I thought these might brighten your day," he said, handing her the bouquet. Emma's heart leaped. Was this a sign of change? She thanked him, clinging to the possibility that the man she fell in love with was still there, beneath the surface. But as the days passed, it became clear that the gesture was fleeting. The distance returned, more palpable than ever. Emma began to wonder if she was holding on to a ghost of what they once had, a love that was no longer mutual, no longer real. The house was eerily quiet one Sunday afternoon, the kind of silence that seemed to amplify the weight in Emma's chest. Daniel had left hours earlier, vaguely mentioning he'd be out with friends, and Emma was alone with her thoughts. In a bid to distract herself, Emma decided to clean out the storage closet. She sifted through boxes of old photos, trinkets from vacations, and handwritten notes they had once exchanged. Then she stumbled upon a small wooden box. She opened it to find a collection of keepsakes she had almost forgotten about: ticket stubs from their first movie date, a pressed flower from their wedding day, and a photo of the two of them on their honeymoon. In the photo, they were standing on a sunlit beach, arms wrapped around each other, smiles so genuine they seemed to glow. Emma barely recognized herself in that image, radiant, carefree, full of hope. Her fingers trembled as she traced the edges of the photo. It was a stark contrast to the woman she saw in the mirror every day now. Tired, anxious, and perpetually bracing for rejection. Tears welled up in her eyes as the truth hit her like a wave. Somewhere along the way, she had stopped living for herself. She had poured all her energy into holding on to Daniel, into fixing what was broken, without ever stopping to ask if he even wanted to be fixed. She realized that the change she had been mourning wasn't just about Daniel, it was about herself too. She had become someone who clung to scraps of affection, who tiptoed around her own home, afraid of saying or doing the wrong thing. The love they once shared had been real, but it was clear now that it was no longer mutual. She couldn't ignore the signs any longer: the distance, the indifference, the blame. Daniel had changed, yes, but so had she, and not for the better. As Emma sat there, clutching the photo, memories flooded her mind. She thought back to the early days of their relationship, when Daniel used to surprise her with coffee at work, or how they would stay up late talking about their dreams. She remembered how he used to look at her, like she was the most important person in his world. But those memories, once a source of joy, now felt like a cruel reminder of what they had lost. Was it worth holding onto something that only existed in the past? One memory stood out sharply. It was from a few months ago, during a rare night out. They had run into an old friend of Daniel's, who had remarked on how perfect they seemed as a couple. Daniel's laughter had been hollow. "Perfect?" he had said, glancing at Emma with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "Yeah, something like that." At the time, Emma had brushed it off, but now, she replayed the moment in her mind and saw it for what it was, a crack in the facade she had been desperately trying to maintain. Emma's tears flowed freely now, a mix of heartbreak, anger, and relief. She was heartbroken for the love she had lost, angry at herself for ignoring the signs, and relieved to finally face the truth. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to feel everything, to acknowledge the depth of her pain instead of pushing it aside. She realized that in trying to save their relationship, she had lost sight of her own worth. "I deserve more than this," she whispered to herself, the words feeling foreign yet empowering. The realization was a turning point. The man she had once known, the man in the photo, was gone, and she couldn't bring him back. But Emma also saw that this change wasn't entirely a loss. It was an opportunity to rediscover herself, to reclaim the parts of her that had been buried under the weight of trying to make someone else happy. This change, painful as it was, could be the beginning of something new. Emma placed the photo back in the box and closed the lid. As she stood up, she felt lighter, as though acknowledging the truth had lifted a burden from her shoulders. That evening, she didn't wait for Daniel to come home. Instead, she poured herself a glass of wine, lit a candle, and sat by the window, journaling her thoughts. She wrote about the person she wanted to become, the Emma who was confident, resilient, and unafraid to put herself first. She didn't have all the answers yet, but she knew one thing for sure: she couldn't keep living like this. The realization marked the first step in her journey toward healing, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope. The evening after Emma's breakthrough was quiet but filled with a sense of purpose. She had made a decision, a promise to herself to no longer let the relationship consume her entire identity. For the first time in months, she felt the stirrings of her old self, the woman who had dreams, passions, and a life outside of being someone's partner. The next morning, Emma woke up early, the sun just beginning to filter through the curtains. She felt a sense of calm, but also an excitement she hadn't felt in a long time. Her to-do list for the day was simple: take a walk, clear her mind, and start focusing on herself. It wasn't that she expected everything to change overnight, but the small actions she would take would add up to a significant shift in her mindset. She began by setting clear boundaries. Daniel had always been the one to dictate their schedule, to decide when they spent time together and when they didn't. No more. She sat down and wrote in her journal, "I am worthy of time and space to be myself. I will no longer be available at his whim." That evening, when Daniel returned home, she was ready. He had his usual distant look, but today she didn't feel the need to chase his attention. As he walked through the door, Emma calmly said, "I need some space tonight. I've got some things to take care of." Daniel, looking confused, tried to initiate a conversation, but Emma stood firm. "I've been doing a lot of thinking, Daniel. We need to start addressing this, or I won't be able to move forward." She felt proud as she said it, her voice steady, her heart no longer racing in fear. The next day, Emma went for a walk in the park, something she hadn't done in years. She had always loved nature, but it was a hobby she had pushed aside in favor of spending time with Daniel. She let the cool air fill her lungs, and with each step, she felt a little more like the woman she used to be. Afterward, she went to a nearby cafe, ordered her favorite coffee, and sat by the window to read a book she had long forgotten about. She lost herself in the pages, a simple act of self-care that had once brought her so much joy. It was these small, seemingly insignificant moments that started to feel like a lifeline. In the following weeks, Emma began to slowly reclaim her hobbies and interests. She joined a yoga class, something she had always wanted to do, but had never prioritized. It wasn't about the physical benefits as much as it was about reconnecting with her own body, learning to be still and listen to herself. She also started writing again, journaling her thoughts, her dreams, her fears. She would sit for hours, allowing her feelings to pour out onto the pages, no longer holding back. However, the changes weren't met with complete acceptance. Daniel noticed Emma's increasing independence, and it unsettled him. He had always been the center of her world, and now he found himself struggling to keep up with the new version of her. One evening, when Emma came home from a yoga class, Daniel confronted her. "You're changing," he said, his voice thick with confusion. "This isn't how it used to be. You've been distant lately." Emma looked him in the eyes, her heart steady. "I've been rediscovering who I am, Daniel, and I won't apologize for that." He scoffed. "So, you're just going to abandon us? You're not even trying to fix this?" Emma could feel the familiar guilt creeping in, the urge to defend herself, to explain that she hadn't abandoned him, but she resisted. She didn't need his approval anymore. "No, I'm not abandoning you," she said, "but I can't keep losing myself. We both need to figure out who we are outside of this relationship. You need to figure out who you are too." Daniel's face hardened, but Emma didn't flinch. This was her turning point, her first real act of self-love in a long time. Despite the small victories, Emma faced an internal battle every single day. The temptation to fall back into old habits was always lurking in the background. She found herself missing the way things used to be, when she could anticipate Daniel's every need and make him happy. It felt easier then. But Emma had begun to understand that easy wasn't always right. She had allowed her life to be shaped by someone else's needs, but now she had the responsibility to shape her own. Some nights she would lie awake, wondering if she was making a mistake, if walking away from Daniel was the right choice. Her heart longed for the comfort of their old connection, but she knew deep down that it wasn't the same anymore. The love they had was fading, and trying to hold onto it only hurt more. It was in these quiet moments of doubt that Emma reminded herself of what she had already achieved: boundaries, self-care, courage. She had taken control of her life, and that was worth celebrating. One weekend, Emma decided to meet up with an old friend, Sarah, whom she hadn't seen in years. The conversation was easy, filled with laughter and stories of their lives since they last met. Sarah remarked how happy Emma seemed. She looked different, more vibrant, like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "That's because I've started taking care of myself," Emma admitted, a proud smile creeping across her face. The victory felt small, but in reality, it was monumental. Emma was learning to enjoy her own company again. She was no longer dependent on Daniel's affection to feel validated. She was discovering that there was more to her life than the relationship she had been clinging to. Weeks passed, and Emma's sense of empowerment continued to grow. She found herself facing new challenges with a calm confidence that had once seemed out of reach. One evening, after a particularly difficult conversation with Daniel, she felt a surge of clarity. She realized that she had already made the biggest change of all. She had chosen herself. She was no longer afraid of the unknown. She had built the strength to live her life on her own terms, without seeking validation from anyone else. As she sat on her balcony, sipping tea and watching the sunset, Emma knew this was just the beginning. There would be more challenges ahead, more difficult conversations, but she was no longer afraid. She had learned to listen to her heart, to trust herself, and above all, to prioritize her own happiness. The evening air had a quiet coolness to it as Emma sat by the window, her gaze lost in the hues of the setting sun. It was a beautiful sight, one she'd often missed in the rush of her daily life. Now it felt different, more significant, as if it were a symbol of everything she had learned in recent months. She took a deep breath, the weight of her journey pressing against her chest. It had been a long road to get here, full of doubts, heartache, and self-discovery. But now, she sat in a place of stillness, no longer yearning for the approval or affection of someone else. Her life, her happiness, no longer depended on the approval of another person. It depended on her, on how she treated herself and the value she placed on her own heart. Over the past few months, Emma had learned a lot about herself, about what she was capable of and what she deserved. In her relationship with Daniel, she had given so much of herself, believing that love meant sacrifice, that happiness was only achievable when two people were in perfect harmony. But that way of thinking had only led her to lose sight of who she was. She had learned that true love wasn't about losing yourself. It wasn't about molding yourself into something you were not to make another person happy. True love began with self-love, and she had spent too long neglecting her own needs. She had allowed herself to be swept into the current of someone else's desires, forgetting that she had dreams too. Emma had learned that relationships should be built on mutual respect, understanding, and growth, both individually and together. Love was not a cage, but a partnership where both individuals could thrive. It was a lesson that had taken time to learn, but she finally understood. She didn't need to compromise who she was for someone else to love her. Emma didn't know what the future held. She didn't have all the answers or a clear path in front of her, but for the first time in a long time, that uncertainty didn't scare her. In fact, it excited her. She had learned how to embrace change, how to trust the process, and how to move forward even when she didn't know where she was headed. There was a certain peace in not having all the answers, in not clinging to a specific outcome. For too long, she had been trying to control everything, to make the relationship work, to hold on to something that had already shifted beyond recognition. Now, she could let go of the need for perfection, for certainty. She could let life unfold naturally, with all its ups and downs. Emma looked out the window again, her reflection blending with the fading sunlight. She had come so far, and though the road ahead might still be difficult, she was no longer afraid. She had learned that healing wasn't a destination, it was a journey, a process that unfolded over time, and she was ready for whatever came next. The story of Emma's journey wasn't just about her, it was about all of us. It was a reminder that we are worthy of love, but that love begins within. We cannot pour from an empty cup, and we cannot expect others to fill the voids we are unwilling to heal within ourselves. We all face moments in our lives when we feel lost, when the people we love seem to change without explanation. It's easy to get caught in the cycle of questioning what went wrong, wondering if we're the problem, or trying to fix things that may not be fixable. But Emma's story is a call to pause, to reflect, and to recognize that sometimes change isn't a bad thing. Sometimes change is the universe's way of redirecting us toward something better, something more aligned with who we are meant to be. The message here is simple yet powerful. You are enough. You don't need to lose yourself in a relationship to prove your worth, and you certainly don't need to hold on to something that no longer serves you. Healing starts when we choose to put ourselves first, to invest in our growth, and to let go of the things that weigh us down. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Emma reflected on the theme that had run through her journey: change. It had come unexpectedly, like a storm she hadn't been prepared for, but in the aftermath, she had emerged stronger. Change had forced her to look within, to question her worth and her desires, and ultimately, to evolve into someone who no longer feared the unknown. The change that had once felt like a loss was now a catalyst for her growth. It had broken her, yes, but it had also rebuilt her, brick by brick, piece by piece. And in that rebuilding, she had found a strength she hadn't known she had. She had learned that change wasn't something to fear. It was an opportunity to evolve, to step into the next chapter of her life with courage and hope. Emma stood up from her seat by the window, feeling the cool evening air brush against her skin. She didn't know what the future held, and perhaps that was the beauty of it. The unknown was no longer a source of anxiety. It was an open field, full of possibilities. Maybe she would find love again, but this time she would not lose herself in it. Maybe she would continue to grow on her own, learning to love herself more each day. Maybe her journey was only beginning. The story of Emma wasn't over. It was just one chapter in the larger narrative of her life, and that perhaps was the greatest message she could leave for the world. Change doesn't mean the end. It means the beginning of something new. As the sky darkened and the stars began to twinkle, Emma stepped outside into the cool night, ready to embrace whatever came next. She had taken the first steps toward her transformation, and no matter what the future held, she knew one thing for sure: she was ready.